Welcome. We're going to talk about consequence-based interventions. Positive behavior intervention basics are really going to be covered in this slideshow. We're going to talk about how to use positive reinforcement, specifically an intervention that is used to encourage and support positive behavior. And this can be used with all students and all abilities. We're going to learn more about how to use positive reinforcement. The symbol here for positive reinforcement in behavioral science is R plus to increase target behaviors, those behaviors that we would like to see more of as teachers, parents, interventionists. First of all, we need to think of the building blocks of behavior in order to really understand what positive reinforcement is. Both reinforcement and punishment are considered consequence-based interventions. So they are what's considered operant conditioning within behavioral science. The relationship between the behavior and the consequence of behavior have consequences. So that's where we see this intervention happen, is within this orange consequence phase of what we call the three-term contingency. The three-term contingency is made up by an antecedent, a behavior, and then the consequence. So here you can see reinforcement is an intervention that is used at this phase of the three-term contingency. And we can have either positive or negative reinforcement. On this visual, you can also see that punishment also lives in this consequence phase of the three-term contingency as well. In this slideshow, we're just going to be talking about the use of the intervention positive reinforcement. When we think about positive reinforcement, right here, this little note says something is added that increases the future frequency of a target behavior. So going back to this slide here of the three-term contingency, positive reinforcement, here's that little plus symbol, is something is added. There is also something called negative reinforcement, where a stimulus is removed to encourage future behavior to happen more frequently. But today's slideshow, we're just going to talk about adding a stimulus or adding something to encourage future behavior. So one thing that you want to consider is how not to use reinforcement as a bribe. I have a whole separate slideshow on that I would love for you to watch after you have gotten through the basic building blocks of positive reinforcement. So the definition of positive reinforcement, again, is reinforcement will increase the frequency of the target behavior. And what it does really is it increases the future target behavior if it is working correctly. So that's one way to know if your intervention strategy is working, is if in the future the target behavior increases. That's how we know it is working. So what are some examples of target behaviors you want to increase? I have 3 blank spots here, so go ahead and pause the video. If you have the printout, you can type those in, or the slide deck. If not, go ahead and pause and just go ahead and think of 3 things that you might want to increase in your classroom, in your clinic, that are positive behaviors, or things that are, I would say, more pro-social behaviors that you would like to increase. I went ahead and added just a few that many teachers and behavioral providers would like to see, including hand raising, completing assignments, and walking in the hallway. These are 3 examples of behaviors that you would want to target to increase in your classroom or in your setting. So now let's think about some things that reinforce you as a person. Reinforcement is part of behavioral science, and it applies to everyone, no matter their age or ability. And all of us have reinforcers within our lives. I've got a couple examples here including the top there, your paycheck, good grades in college, maybe Netflix, chocolate. I've got a few extra lines, so go ahead and pause the video and think of a few more things that reinforce you, that encourage you to have those target behaviors. For example, getting good grades is a reinforcement for you to continue to do well in school, participate, do your homework, etc. Go ahead and pause and fill that out. As far as different classifications based on origin for reinforcers, we have in the yellow here unconditioned, which are also known as primary reinforcers. Those are the things that we don't have to condition, they're just very naturally reinforcing for us. Food, sex, sleep, water, warmth, and tactile stimulation are naturally reinforcing. But then you see in the green, conditioned reinforcers, also known as secondary or learned reinforcers, are things like money, grades, and praise. Money, for example, has been conditioned to be a reinforcer because we can buy things with it. We can buy things that we like with it. But money itself is actually just a piece of paper. So it has been conditioned through conditioning in our society to be a reinforcer for us. So think about what reinforces your clients or your students. Sometimes I use clients and students interchangeably because I'm a teacher and a behavior analyst. Sometimes clients are intrinsically motivated to do well. This was me as a student. I don't know if anyone else was also reinforced or just naturally intrinsically motivated to do well, but I didn't need a lot of extrinsic things to reinforce me. Other clients need extrinsic motivation or reinforcement. Our clients with special needs may need reinforcement. So sometimes people say, oh, I don't want to have to use reinforcement, but there are students and clients that definitely need reinforcement to continually have and exhibit that positive behavior. So classification of reinforcers by formal properties. So there's different ways to classify them when you're thinking of what to reinforce. So when you think about what reinforces your students, we're going to look at different categories, and within a formal category, like the form of it, to think about when you're brainstorming of what different types of things you might want to bring in to provide as reinforcers. So if you have access to the printout or the slide deck, I'd like you to take a minute and fill out some ideas of what your students or clients might like as far as edible reinforcers. You can write or type into these blue text boxes. Edible reinforcers might be something like crackers or Skittles, for example. Another formal property is sensory. A lot of my students and clients with autism really enjoy sensory reinforcers. Light up toys, toys that have sounds, songs, for example, are things that are reinforcing. Tangible. So those are kind of physical items that they have access to. And activity reinforcers. I have one example here. Computer time, reading books is an example of an activity reinforcer. And the last one here to think about is social reinforcers. So think about the things like verbal praise, those type of things that might be kind of socially reinforcing. Tickles. There can be some crossover because tickles could also be considered sensory, but think about a couple ideas here that might be reinforcing for your students to have a bank of ideas kind of going for what might be reinforcing. So, after you've taken some time to fill out some ideas for reinforcers, I want you to consider a few things about reinforcement. One thing is the schedule of reinforcement, also known as kind of how often you're going to be reinforcing the student. So, VI stands for variable interval. In behavioral science, it is considered the most powerful form of reinforcement. Think of, I have in parentheses here, think of a slot machine in Vegas. This is variable as far as you don't know when the big payout's going to be. So it is also the hardest type of reinforcement to fade because it is the most potent and the most strong form of reinforcement. The next type of schedule of reinforcement is continuous, and this is typically what we start with a new or a difficult skill. That generally means that every instance of the behavior is reinforced. Continuous. The next one is intermittent, and that can be a schedule of reinforcement for familiar or more easy skills. And then on the other end of the continuum of schedule is something called extinction, which is a behavioral term that basically means behavior that you want to eliminate, you stop giving any reinforcement to. So, for example, if there is a child who will cry to get an item, then when you stop reinforcing, like stop giving them the item for crying, what you're doing is you're putting that behavior on extinction. You are stopping the reinforcement that is given for that crying. Over time, it will go down. However, extinction does come with a couple caveats where there is something called an extinction burst, where the student will at one point try to actually the behavior will increase, really trying to get that reinforcement back. And then often the behavior will go back down. So, extinction, it's really important to be very consistent across all team members, all settings, if you're going to use this strategy. So, this last little thing to consider is gradually fade schedules of reinforcement as a skill is learned. Also, fade from artificial to more natural reinforcers. Okay, so another thing to consider with reinforcement is something called a preference assessment. A preference assessment is trying to figure out exactly what they like from those formal categories that you have kind of decided that they like. And also, you want to think about how often you want to check a preference assessment. So, I have a box here for you to write in if you have the slide deck. If not, go ahead and use a piece of paper and think about how often you would want to do a preference assessment to see what they like. For a minute, for some students and clients, you want to do a preference assessment often. For others, you kind of know what they want and they don't get what you call satiated on an item. What you really want to do is make sure you're keeping the items that you use as reinforcers as strong, potent reinforcers, and that they don't lose kind of their reinforcing value by having access to them all the time. Ideally, a reinforcer is really only used or available after a child has exhibited the skill or the target behavior you want them to exhibit for that reinforcer. So it's not something that they would necessarily have access to all the time. So it's just like you and I, if we have something that really motivates us, like let's just say for me, I really like Skittles. If I had free access all the time to Skittles, I would eventually lose interest in them. It would become something that I would become satiated on. But if Skittles were something I only got if I, ran a mile on the treadmill, for example, then it would stay very strong and reinforcing. So here are some 10 rules for reinforcement. I have a whole separate slideshow for that if you'd like to look it over. But take a moment, read through this. You can pause the screen and see everything that you really need to think about for rules of reinforcement. One thing I want to point out is number 9. In the early teaching, make sure to label the behavior that is being reinforced. So getting away from just a general good job and really focus on labeling. Thank you for walking in the hallway, for example, as you're giving that reinforcement. Being really specific with your labeling of the behavior is going to really help a student understand what they're doing well. So now we're going to go into talking more about how to use a token board for reinforcers. So if this is something that interests you, you can continue the recording. If your students might be able to use this within their setting, I would say this is a great way to use positive reinforcement within a system that is a really visual, great research-based system to use reinforcement. So here is a visual example of a token board. It just simply says what I'm working for. Right here is a spot where you can put what they're working for, like either an icon, or if they have words, you can write it in here. And what you would do is cut out these tokens, and the tokens would go on here with some Velcro. So tokens are, again, considered a generalized condition reinforcer. We have conditioned it to be, once they get the tokens, they would get what you consider exchange the second one for a backup reinforcer, something that they have earned, that they've identified that they would like to work for. You identify that reinforcer when you do a preference assessment. So it does help reduce learner frustration when they know how long they have for a task, because the token board also kind of serves as a bit of a visual timer as far as how many items need to be completed before that reinforcement is done. So when you use tokens during token training, what you want to start with is pairing every token with a tangible reinforcer. So again, going back to that schedule of reinforcement, that is what's considered continuous reinforcement. So every time they engage in the target behavior, you are providing a token. Once tokens are established as condition reinforcers, for example, are reinforcing on their own, they can be delivered without a tangible reinforcer eventually. So ration tokens in order to adjust the amount of time the child is at the table. Okay, so that concludes our slideshow for positive reinforcement. I would say definitely embrace positive reinforcement as a positive behavioral intervention within your classroom. Thank you for watching, and I really look forward to hearing how you integrate positive reinforcement to encourage your students' positive pro-social behavior in your classroom, in your setting, in your clinic. Thanks for being an inclusive educator.